This series is called Classical Americana, and we've been focusing on American composers and American musicians. And I'm so happy that Jeremy's joining me tonight. We're going to talk about both of those things, American composers and being American musicians.
Indeed.
It's when you got here today, I was just thinking about what we were going to talk about tonight, and one of the composers we're going to focus on is Charles Ives, who is, I think we could say, one of the great innovators in American music.
Sure.
Iconoclast, maverick.
A Yankee, cantankerous iconoclast, yes.
Yeah, but somebody who did unexpected things.
He's one of the few insurance magnates to be a great musical figure. Yeah.
I'm thinking mostly in his music.
The music is, obviously, many of you probably heard a piece of Ives that has kind of unspeakable dissonances and chaos. He was very interested in chaos, almost as a kind of organizing principle. He was trying to, many of the innovations of the 100 years since he died or so, they trace themselves to him. And one of them is sort of this postmodern mixing of things, genres, high and low or whatever. Another one is this kind of cinematic, trying to recreate a scene in all its unruly possibilities. Like one of my favorite Ives pieces is the Sinking of the Lusitania. I forget what that one's called, where people they're in New York on the harbor, and they hear the news of the sinking of the Lusitania, and they begin to spontaneously break into this hymn to mourn the people who've been lost. And there's this amazing kind of crowd noise that Ives creates, right? And then there's this gradual swirling and gathering of the hymn out of it. And when he was at his best, Ives was able to do these things that really no composer had tried to do before.
It's realism almost.
It's, super realism. I guess you can look back in the Renaissance and see people doing kind of things like that, and occasionally in the 19th century, but nothing quite as dramatic and also willing to be ugly as Ives was, I
think we should talk about Ives and your relationship with Ives, but would you like to play Ives first?
Sure. Do you want me to set it up? What the piece is?
Yeah.
I'm going to play for you, maybe you know this piece, the Alcotts. It's the third movement of the famous Concord Sonata, which is the piece that sort of made Ives famous to the extent that and all four movements are portraits of transcendentalists figures. And this is the Alcott family, Bronson Alcott, who was the patriarch, and of course, Louisa May and Little Women and all that. I've been to that little house, Orchard House. There's still the little piano in there. Yeah. I'd like to think it's the same piano, but I don't think it is. But it's a portrait of the kids at the piano playing at various things, Scotch airs and Mendelssohn Wedding March and some things you'll surely recognize, unmistakable classical quotes.
Yeah. little bit of background into, who he was and why he ended up being what he was as a musician, which starts with his father.
It does start with his father. He's from Danbury, Connecticut. His father was the town band master, and an eccentric. I think there were a lot of those floating around Connecticut in those days. And, the famous story, the father was an experimenter. He liked to send like two bands through the town square playing two pieces and stand in the middle and hear what it sounds like, the chaos of the two pieces interacting. We don't know if Charles sort of partly made up that story, but
It's possible.
certainly his father had this sort of tinkerer's quality. If we do this with music, if we put it in the wrong, and he had this like, don't dumb down music, try to stretch what music will be able to do and say. And obviously Charles, then he took that, not just to heart, but ridiculous to liver, to every other organ, right? He just went nuts. He went and ran with that philosophy, and he ended up in Yale, and then he started to try to make a career in New York as a professional composer and musician, and he experienced a lot of both self-doubt and external doubt.
Well, it was such a weird time in music, right? What was sort of the norm? There were many different interpretations of it, and he was none of those.
Yeah, well, I mean, American classical music was classical, whatever that means.
Yeah.
But that whole part of American musical life at that time was extremely conservative and extremely European.
Looking backwards.
Everyone went to Europe to study, and they came back more or less imitating and writing. It's sort of like late romantic still. There wasn't, any of this sort of high modernist stuff just yet. So, and Ives wrote pieces for church, and he was an organist. I should mention that. He was an organist, so he loved like vast combinations of things. When
Well, like if you took, sorry.
No, you say. What were
No,
you
it's like if you took what we just heard and you amplify that in orchestral terms, I mean, that's what he was trying to do, is all of that, but times however many instruments you have in the orchestra.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
He loved to play with, the scores are vast, different orchestras. Often, what's the famous one with 2 or 3 orchestras, different orchestras? Yeah.
There's another story about his father, which was he's outside listening to the church bells and then he's running back inside trying to find the notes on the piano.
Right.
And then he ends up saying the church bells, the notes that he's hearing are in between the keys.
Yeah, of course. Of course they are. That there's that beautiful. If you don't know Ives, if you don't want to know Ives or whatever, there is one track that I usually recommend to people that are skeptics, which is the song "The Housatonic" at Stockbridge, which portrays hearing a hymn from across a river. And there's a famous recording of Jan de Gaetani and Gil Kalish of that. And I think if you don't like that, you're probably never going to like Ives. But it's that same, you hear the bells and then the sort of weird clusters of sound, and then within it, the hymn kind of. He had that gift, and I think that's, if you had to say one of his best things, is that he took these very, very well-worn, cliched tunes that surrounded him, and he reframed them so they sounded new.
Yeah. It's an interesting contrast and companion to Ives in some very different ways. So if you've been to this series before, we've spent a good bit of time here looking at music by Black American composers, going back to the 19th century, music that has not been so well known or so celebrated in our history, and that really deserves to be known and loved. And you're bringing a composer we haven't discussed. Someone who had a really, really tragic life, but who was incredibly innovative and created some music that was, I think, ahead of his time. You want to talk a little bit about Blind Tom?
Blind Tom Wiggins. Any of you know this character from? If you lived in America in the 1860s.
Did anyone live in America in the 1860s?
Yeah. If you lived in America in the 1860s or 70s, you would have known of Blind Tom Wiggins. He was a huge celebrity. And he was an incredibly lucrative touring
commodity.
act. Yeah. And he was an enslaved person who was also blind and autistic and a piano prodigy phenom, right? And he composed And he never left his owner, right?
Right.
And he never wanted to, apparently. And the whole legacy is that he was such an important part of American musical life at this time. And the piece I'm going to play for you is his most famous piece, which he wrote when he was just a kid, I think 15 or 16. Yeah. And it celebrates a Confederate victory during the Civil War, the Battle of Manassas. Mm-hmm. It's a realist scene, and I won't give away, but it tells, it's very, sometimes I yell out the things that happen, if I can remember what happens. Are we ready for me to play it now? Is that the idea? Yeah, okay, the Battle of Manassas.
Composed in, it's 61?
Well, it's got to be, I think it was composed, 1862, 1860, somewhere around there.
The point being, it was right as the events had just occurred.
Yes, and he would play it to rapturous applause to various Southern audiences.
Yes.
Yeah. It ends, well, if I yell it out, I'll yell, okay. Yeah. The Southern Army marches in. The eve of battle. The battle implements are prepared.
we're going to, for no particular reason, play a little something together just because we're both here. And we found something that we could play with one piano. So this is from a set by Samuel Barber called Souvenirs. It was a ballet suite. And we're going to play the third movement, which is a pas de deux.